I parked my RV at the edge of Deep Creek Quarry in the heart of Utah, hoping for solitude to clear my head and reconnect with my passion for geology. The jagged cliffs framed by a setting sun cast long shadows across the vast chasm, the kind of untouched beauty that seemed perfect for my research. Freshly divorced and needing space, I had planned this trip to rediscover myself through my work. Away from the noise of everything falling apart in my life. As night fell, I unloaded my gear in the quiet stillness. The quarry was abandoned, its history evident in the rusted remains of mining equipment scattered around its edges. Broken tracks, crumbled shafts, and scaffolds long claimed by nature. A faint metallic tang hung in the cool evening air, mixed with something less identifiable, something sharp that lingered just enough to prickle my senses. I chalked it up to the isolation, brushed the feeling aside, and got to work. By the second evening, I had sunk into the rhythm of my research. The steady tap of my chisel breaking against stone helped silence the thoughts I'd come to escape. The sun dipped lower, painting the rocks in hues of orange and crimson when I heard it, a whistle. Soft at first, almost melodic, it carried through the stillness like a song meant only for me. I froze, chisel midair, listening intently. It rose and fell with an eerie precision, unlike any bird call I'd ever heard. The sound unsettled me. I scanned the quarry's edge, its walls now bathed in shadow. There was no one, not a trace of movement except for the slight rustle of the breeze. Shaking off the unease, I packed my tools and made my way back to the RV. The whistling followed, echoing faintly against the cliffs, growing louder with each step. By the time I slammed the RV door shut and locked it, my heart was pounding, though the silence that followed was immediate and absolute. The next morning, I met Emily, a wildlife photographer I found crouched by the creek that bordered the forest near the quarry. Her camera clicked away at a heron perched elegantly on a rock. When I greeted her, she looked up and smiled brightly, though her eyes betrayed a wariness that seemed out of place. "Nice camera," I said, nodding toward her setup. "Thanks," she replied. "You camping near the quarry?" I nodded. "Geologist, came to study the rock formations." Her expression tightened slightly. "Wildlife photographer," she said with a forced laugh. "But the quarry? Kind of a creepy place to set up shop." I wanted to laugh it off, but something in her tone stopped me. Later that evening, the whistling returned, louder now, more insistent. Shadows flitted at the edges of my vision as I worked late into the evening. When I shone my flashlight toward the cliffs, I soused. Cassie tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "The quarry's not exactly the friendliest place to camp," she said, her tone light but her expression darkening. "Locals say it's got a reputation." I tried to laugh it off. "A reputation? For what?" She hesitated, brushing her hair out of her face. "Weird sounds, strange lights, people disappearing. You know, the kind of stuff that makes for campfire stories." Her attempt at humor fell flat, and she turned her attention back to her camera. "But maybe that's just me being paranoid." I shrugged it off, though her words clung to me as I walked back toward the quarry. Campfire stories didn't scare me. Rocks and soil told their own tales, and they didn't lie. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Even the rusted machinery around the quarry seemed more menacing in the daylight. By late afternoon, I was back at work. The sharp crack of my chisel against the rock echoed through the pit, filling the emptiness with sound. For hours I catalogued samples, taking detailed notes on the striations in the quarry walls. The rhythm of the work was calming, almost meditative. The weight of my thoughts faded, replaced by the familiar language of geology. But as the sun sank low, painting the cliffs in gold and crimson, the whistling returned. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably deliberate. The eerie melody cut through the stillness like a blade, rising and falling in haunting patterns. My breath caught as I set my tools down and turned, scanning the quarry for the source. My eyes darted over the jagged walls and the dark mouth of the collapsed shaft, but there was nothing, just empty shadows and stone. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dim light. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the rocks, quick and fluid. My chest tightened, and I aimed the flashlight toward the spot, but there was nothing there. Only silence, broken by the faint whistle drifting closer. My heart pounded as I packed up my gear, my hands fumbling with the tools. The sound followed me, growing louder as I climbed back toward the RV. Every step felt heavier, as though the quarry itself was trying to hold me in place. By the time I reached the RV and slammed the door behind me, the whistling was so loud it drowned out my ragged breathing. Then, it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing in on me like a physical weight. I stood there for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound. When none came, I let out a shaky breath and turned off my flashlight. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. The next morning, the whistling was still fresh in my mind, an unshakable memory that made the quarry feel more sinister in the daylight. I decided to explore further, hoping logic and science could explain away the unease that clung to me like a second skin. But before I could head back into the pit, Cassie appeared at my campsite. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes shadowed and her movements a little too stiff. She greeted me with a tense smile and said, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about geology and formations. Mind if I tag along today?" I wasn't sure why she was so interested, but I figured company might help take the edge off. We headed to the quarry together, her camera swinging around her neck. She kept close, her gaze flitting over the cliffs as if she expected something to leap out at any moment. By midday, I'd managed to push the strange events to the back of my mind. I was focused on my notes, scribbling observations and measurements into my journal, when Cassie spoke up. "You heard it again, didn't you?" Her words caught me off guard. I looked up, startled, and saw her watching me intently. I hesitated. "The whistling?" she nodded. "It's not just the wind. I've heard it too. Last night." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice low. "But there's something you need to see." She led me to the far side of the quarry, where the walls sloped into a narrow crevice. The rocks here were marked, deep gouges carved into the stone in jagged, deliberate patterns. They were unlike anything I'd seen before, their edges too sharp to be natural. The carvings formed symbols, shapes I couldn't recognize, but that stirred something primal in me, a sense of warning. Cassie traced her fingers over one of the marks, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been here a long time. Before I could respond, the whistling began again. This time, it was deafening. The sound didn't drift on the wind, it surrounded us, echoing off the walls and filling the space with its eerie melody. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound felt like it was inside my head, vibrating in my skull. Cassie grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We scrambled out of the crevice, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural stillness. As we climbed back toward the surface, shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. I dared to glance back once and froze. Figures moved in the quarry below, tall, gaunt shapes that glided silently across the rocks. Their faces were pale and featureless, but their mouths were wide open, emitting the sound that had haunted me since I arrived. The whistlers were real. Cassie and I didn't stop running until we were back at the RV. My lungs burned, and my hands shook as I fumbled with the keys to unlock the door. Behind us, the quarry loomed, its shadows stretching like claws across the clearing. The whistling had stopped, but the silence felt worse, thick and oppressive, as if the air itself was watching. Once inside, I locked every door and window, checking them twice. Cassie paced the small space, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. She looked pale, her face shiny with sweat. "Did you see them?" she whispered, though it came out more like a gasp. I nodded, my mouth dry. "What were they?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but they've been here a lot longer than we have." That answer didn't sit well with me. I had always believed that the natural world could explain everything, every strange occurrence, every odd phenomenon. But those things with their hollow faces and impossible mouths didn't fit into any scientific framework I knew. "I think it's the carvings," Cassie said suddenly, breaking the silence. "They're connected somehow. It's like a warning." I wanted to dismiss her theory, but the image of those deep, jagged gouges was seared into my mind. They weren't natural. They weren't random. And now that I thought about it, the whistlers had been near those markings, as if drawn to them. Cassie sat down across from me, her hands trembling as she fiddled with her camera. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "Last night, I saw lights." "Lights?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She nodded. "In the forest, near the creek. They weren't fireflies or anything like that. They were unnatural, moving in patterns, like they were searching for something." "Or someone," I muttered, the words heavy in the air. That night, neither of us could sleep. We kept the lights off, watching the darkness outside through the slits in the blinds. Every creak of the RV felt like a threat, every gust of wind a whisper. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night to the sound of soft tapping against the RV's door. It was faint but deliberate, a slow and rhythmic knock that made my skin crawl. My breath caught as I reached for my flashlight. Cassie stirred beside me, her eyes snapping open. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "Don't open it." The knocking stopped, replaced by something worse, the whistling. It started softly, just outside the RV, but quickly grew louder, filling the small space with its haunting melody. My chest tightened as I realized it wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside. Cassie and I exchanged a look of pure terror. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest as the whistling rose to a deafening pitch. Something was here, and it wasn't going to leave. The whistling swirled around us, impossibly loud, as if the walls of the RV couldn't contain it. My flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, casting erratic beams across the cramped interior. Shadows danced in every corner, twisting unnaturally, their movements wrong in ways that made my stomach churn. Cassie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to get out of here," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the deafening sound. I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed to stay put. Something primal, something ancient, told me leaving the RV would be worse. But as the whistling grew louder, I realized we didn't have a choice. The air had become heavy and suffocating, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was alive, a force reaching into the depths of my mind, pulling at my fears. Cassie yanked open the door, and the whistling stopped instantly. The silence was as sharp and jarring as a slap. We both froze, staring out into the darkness beyond the RV. The forest loomed ahead, the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, maybe the nightmare had finally passed. Then I saw them. Figures moved among the trees, their gaunt forms barely illuminated by the weak moonlight. They were taller than I remembered, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and disjointed. Their faces remained blank, pale ovals that tilted unnaturally as they turned toward us. And then their mouths opened. The whistling returned, piercing and relentless, vibrating through the air like a weapon. My flashlight flickered again, the beam weak and unsteady. I took a step back, and Cassie grabbed my wrist, pulling me down the RV steps. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cracking under the strain. We bolted into the forest, the ground uneven beneath our feet. Branches whipped at my face, and the cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare look back. The whistling followed us, its melody twisting and growing louder, filling every corner of the dark woods. It wasn't just behind us anymore. It was everywhere, reverberating through the trees, the ground, the air. Cassie tripped, falling hard onto the rocky terrain. I skidded to a stop and turned back, my chest heaving as I reached down to pull her up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed behind me. "They're coming," she whispered. I turned and saw them emerging from the shadows, their movements impossibly fast now. One of the figures reached out with elongated arms, its fingers stretching unnaturally toward us. The whistling grew deafening, and I felt my legs lock in place, my body refusing to move. Then a light cut through the darkness, blinding and warm. It wasn't a flashlight or the moon. It was something else, something alive. The figures stopped abruptly, their forms trembling before retreating back into the shadows. But the light wasn't here to save us. It wanted something. And I knew it wasn't done. The light hovered in the distance, shifting like a living entity, its glow unnatural and hypnotic. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, sterile, and somehow invasive, as though it were peeling back the layers of the forest to expose every hidden truth. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just illuminating the darkness. It was watching us. Cassie gripped my arm tightly, her fingers trembling. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears left by the whistling. I don't know, I muttered, though every instinct screamed that this light wasn't something we were meant to see. We backed away slowly, but the light moved with us, its brightness intensifying. The forest around us seemed to vanish, swallowed by the stark glow. The trees dissolved into vague shadows, their shapes warping and bending. I felt disoriented, like the ground beneath me wasn't steady anymore. Cassie pulled on my sleeve. We can't stay here. We need to move. I nodded numbly and we turned to run again, but the light surged forward, cutting us off. Split into smaller orbs, each one weaving through the trees with an eerie, deliberate precision. They encircled us, creating a perimeter of glowing white. My heart raced as I realized we were trapped. And then the whistling returned. It was softer now, almost melodic, but that made it worse. The sound was closer, more intimate, as though it were being whispered directly into my ear. I clapped my hands over my head, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. Beside me, Cassie stumbled, her knees buckling under the oppressive weight of the noise. "They're coming!" she gasped, her voice cracking. I turned toward the encroaching shadows and saw the figures again. They moved with unsettling grace, their elongated limbs seeming to glide over the forest floor. Their featureless faces glowed faintly in the light, and their mouths, those impossible gaping mouths, emitted the haunting whistle that now filled every corner of my mind. Desperation took over. I grabbed Cassie by the arm, dragging her to her feet. "Come on!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the growing cacophony. We ran blindly into the forest, crashing through the underbrush. The orbs followed, weaving through the trees like predators herding their prey. My legs burned, and my lungs felt ready to burst, but I didn't dare slow down. The whistlers were close. I could feel them, hear the sound of their elongated limbs scraping against the bark. The light surged ahead of us, blocking our path. This time, it didn't retreat. Instead, it shifted, forming into something vaguely human. The figure stood impossibly tall, its body glowing with the same cold, sterile light. It raised an arm, and for a brief moment, the whistling stopped. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from all directions, it spoke a single word: "Stay." The forest seemed to close in, and I realized, with a sinking dread, that it wasn't giving us a choice. The word hung in the air, resonating through the forest like a physical force. "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was a warning, or maybe even a promise. The glowing figure remained still, its arm outstretched, but its presence seemed to press against me, heavy and oppressive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Beside me, Cassie stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the whistling started again, low and haunting, but this time it wasn't coming from behind us. It came from within the glowing figure. Its faceless head tilted slightly, and the sound grew louder, more piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Cassie grabbed my hand, her grip ice cold. "We can't stay here," she whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "We have to move." I nodded, swallowing hard, and took a cautious step back. The figure didn't move, but the light around it pulsed, flickering in time with the whistling. The shadows behind it seemed to writhe, shifting and stretching toward us. The forest itself felt alive, twisting and changing, as though it were reshaping to trap us. "We go together," I said, my voice barely more. Then a whisper: "Don't let go of me." Cassie nodded, and we began to inch backward, one slow step at a time. The whistling grew sharper, almost angry, as if it knew we were defying whatever force had brought us here. The figure's arm dropped to its side and it turned slightly, its glowing body blurring at the edges like a fading memory. And then it started to move. It didn't walk, it glided, its form flickering and distorting as it advanced. The light it emitted grew brighter, washing out the trees and casting long, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally around us. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though the earth itself was shifting. I tightened my grip on Cassie's hand, pulling her as we stumbled away from the figure. "Run!" I shouted, breaking into a sprint. We tore through the forest, the glowing figure and its pulsing light following us like a predator stalking its prey. The whistling grew louder and more erratic, joined by a strange, guttural hum that vibrated through my chest. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them, the whistlers. They emerged from the shadows, their gaunt forms moving impossibly fast, their hollow faces fixed on us. The glowing figure raised its arm again, and the forest in front of us seemed to warp, the trees bending and twisting to block our path. Cassie screamed as she stumbled over a root, falling hard onto the ground. I skidded to a stop and turned back, grabbing her under the arms to haul her up. "They're closing in!" she cried, her voice ragged. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, dragging her with me as the forest closed in and the light grew brighter, swallowing everything around us. The forest around us felt alive, shifting and bending to cut off every escape. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. The glowing figure was no longer just following. It was everywhere. The light refracted off every surface, creating a maze of blinding brightness and deep shadows that disoriented us with every step. Cassie clung to me, her breath coming in shallow gasps as we stumbled forward. "It's playing with us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's not letting us leave." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind raced, trying to find some semblance of logic in the chaos, but nothing made sense. The whistling was louder now, piercing and relentless, weaving in and out of the guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't just sound, it was something tangible, something alive. Ahead, a faint opening appeared, a break in the trees. I tightened my grip on Cassie's arm and pointed. "There! Keep moving!" We ran toward it, our footsteps pounding against the uneven forest floor. The light flickered violently, the glowing figure appearing and disappearing at the edges of my vision, its movements impossibly fast. The whistlers closed in. Behind us, their elongated limbs cutting through the air like blades. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them, their presence cold and suffocating, pressing against my spine. We burst through the opening and skidded to a stop. My stomach dropped as I realized where we were. The quarry. The jagged cliffs loomed ahead, their edges casting sharp shadows over the rocky pit. The air was thick with the metallic tang of stone, and the deep chasm stretched out before us, dark and endless. Cassie turned to me, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "What do we do now?" Before I could answer, the whistling surged, deafening and shrill. The glowing figure appeared at the edge of the quarry, its body flickering like a dying flame. It raised its arm, and the ground beneath us trembled violently. Cracks spread through the rocky surface, and a low rumble echoed from the depths of the quarry. Cassie grabbed my arm. "We can't stay here." I nodded, but the glow from the figure pulsed again, freezing us in place. The whistlers emerged from the forest, their gaunt forms moving unnaturally as they encircled us. Their mouths opened wide, impossibly wide, and the whistling became unbearable, a symphony of terror that rattled my bones. I pulled Cassie toward the edge of the quarry, desperation overriding fear. "We have to climb down." "Are you insane?" she shouted, her voice nearly drowned out by the noise. "It's the only way," I yelled back. But as we moved toward the edge, the glowing figure glided closer, blocking our path. Its light was blinding now, erasing everything but the pit behind us and the whistlers closing in. I realized with a sinking dread that we were out of time. The ground beneath our feet trembled as if the quarry itself was alive, reacting to the presence of the glowing figure and the advancing whistlers. The cracks spidered outward, deepening with each pulse of light, and the air grew thicker, suffocating us with its weight. Cassie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "There's nowhere to go," she cried, her voice cracking under the strain. The glowing figure stopped mere feet from us, its form towering and pulsating with an unnatural brilliance. Its arms stretched out, pointing directly at me. The gesture was deliberate, accusatory, as though it was singling me out for some unknown crime. The whistling swelled to a crescendo, intertwining with the hum that had become a relentless vibration in my chest. I felt my knees weaken, my body folding under the weight of the sound. Cassie yanked on my arm. "Don't let it take you!" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. But I couldn't move. My legs were rooted to the spot, and my vision blurred as the figure's light grew impossibly bright. Shadows swirled around it, forming grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted, their movements unnatural and hypnotic. The whistlers closed the circle, their gaunt forms bending unnaturally as they reached for us, their mouths gaping wider with each step. Then, without warning, the whistling stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. Cassie and I both gasped, clutching at each other as we tried to steady ourselves. The glowing figure tilted its head slightly, its faceless form radiating an unspoken question. Behind us, the ground gave way. The edge of the quarry crumbled, and we tumbled backward into the void. The fall seemed endless, the darkness swallowing us as the light from the figure faded above. My heart pounded, the rush of wind roaring in my ears, but it wasn't the fall that terrified me. It was the sound rising from the depths below. A new noise, guttural and primal, like the earth itself groaning in pain. We hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I lay there, dazed, staring up at the jagged outline of the quarry's edge far above. Cassie groaned beside me, clutching her arm. "We have to move," I rasped, struggling to. My body screamed in protest, but the sound from the darkness below was growing louder. Cassie looked at me, her face pale and streaked with blood. What is that?" I turned and saw it. A massive shadow rising from the depths, its form indistinct but horrifyingly large. It moved with an otherworldly fluidity, its edges flickering like the glow of the figure above. The whistler's melody began again, faint and distant, as though they were summoning it. Whatever it was coming for us. And this time, I wasn't sure there was any way out. The shadow from the depths rose higher, its massive form blotting out what little light remained. It moved with a terrible grace, shifting like liquid smoke, its edges writhing and stretching into grotesque shapes that defied logic. My breath hitched as it let out a deep, guttural moan, a sound so low and resonant that I felt it in my bones. Cassie stumbled to her feet, clutching her injured arm. "We can't stay here!" she cried, her voice raw with panic. I grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The cavern floor was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and debris from the quarry's collapse. Above us, the faint glow of the figure still lingered, its light, dim and distant, as if it were watching, waiting. Behind us, the whistling started again. It was softer now, almost melodic, but it carried an undeniable threat. The whistlers had descended into the quarry, their pale forms visible at the edge of the pit. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though herding us toward the rising shadow. Cassie tugged on my arm. "Where do we go?" she demanded, her voice cracking. I scanned the cavern, my mind racing. To our left, a narrow passageway wound into the darkness, its walls tight and jagged. It wasn't a good option, but it was the only option. I pointed. "There! We can lose them in the tunnels." She hesitated, glancing back at the towering shadow that now loomed over the quarry floor. Its amorphous form began to split, tendrils of darkness snaking outward, dragging across the ground as though searching for something. "Cassie, move!" I shouted, pulling her toward the passageway. We sprinted toward the opening, the whistling growing louder with every step. The sound twisted in the air, layering on itself until it became a cacophony of dissonant notes that made my ears ache and my head pound. The tendrils of the shadow lashed out, slamming into the ground behind us, sending a shockwave that nearly knocked us off our feet. We dove into the narrow passage, the walls closing in around us. The sound of the whistling was muted here, muffled by the weight of the rock. The air was damp and stale, filled with the scent of earth and decay. Cassie leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "What was that thing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice shaking. "But it's not natural. None of this is." The ground beneath us trembled again, a distant rumble echoing through the passage. The shadow wasn't giving up. It was coming for us, squeezing itself into the tunnels, its tendrils scraping against the walls with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I grabbed Cassie's hand. "We keep moving," I said. "We can't stop now." She nodded, and we plunged deeper into the darkness, the faint glow of my flashlight barely keeping the encroaching terror at bay. But in my heart, I knew this wasn't a place we could escape. It was a place meant to trap us. Forever. The tunnel narrowed as we pressed deeper into the darkness, the jagged walls closing in like a slowly constricting vice. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unreliable, casting erratic shadows that danced along the rock. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the sound wasn't bouncing off the walls but coming back altered, layered with faint whispers that didn't belong to us. Behind us, the shadow wasn't far. Its tendrils scraped and slithered against the tunnel's edges, their movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring its hunt. Each scrape was a dagger to my nerves, a constant reminder that escape wasn't guaranteed. Cassie stumbled beside me, her breathing shallow and uneven. She clutched her injured arm, her flashlight swinging wildly in her free hand. It's following us," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied through gritted teeth, trying to keep my panic in check. "But we have to keep moving." We turned a sharp corner, the tunnel splitting into two paths ahead. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to choose carefully. The left passage sloped downward into deeper darkness, while the right seemed to twist and climb, its uneven walls jagged and foreboding. I didn't have time to deliberate. "This way," I said, pulling Cassie toward the right. The moment we moved, the tunnel trembled, and a low groan echoed from the depths behind us. The shadow was closer now. I could feel it, a suffocating presence that filled the air with dread. As we climbed, the whispers grew louder, merging with the faint sound of the whistling. My chest tightened as the melody twisted into something new, sharp and discordant, like it was trying to burrow into my mind. Cassie stumbled again, falling to her knees. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering before going dark. "Cassie," I dropped to her side, shaking her shoulder. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her lips trembling as she whispered something I couldn't make out. "What are you saying?" I demanded, panic clawing at me. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the growing hum in the air. They're inside. The whispers. They're in my head." I pulled her to her feet, my heart pounding. "Ignore them. Don't listen, just keep moving." But even as I said it, I felt it too. The whispers creeping into my thoughts, twisting my own voice into something unfamiliar. They spoke of fear, of guilt, of failure, dredging up memories I had buried long ago. The weight of it was crushing, like the tunnel itself was collapsing around me. We stumbled forward, the path narrowing again. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath a painful reminder of how far we'd fallen. Behind us, the shadow surged, its tendrils reaching out, stretching impossibly far. I could see it now, its form filling the tunnel, its mass consuming the dim light from my flashlight. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in feeling, a raw, visceral emotion that pierced through every thought: despair. This was no longer a chase. It was an end. The wordless despair that emanated from the shadow was suffocating, pressing into my chest like a vice. It wasn't just fear. It was deeper, more primal, pulling at every regret, every failure, every moment I tried to bury. My legs felt weak, my movements sluggish, as if the air itself were conspiring to hold me in place. Cassie leaned heavily on me, her body trembling. "I can't do this," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "It's in my head. It knows. It knows everything," I said through clenched teeth, forcing one foot in front of the other. "But it doesn't matter. We keep going." The tunnel opened into a small cavern, its ceiling high and jagged, dripping with moisture that reflected faint light from an unseen source. The air was colder here, almost frigid, and the whispers that had haunted us were louder, echoing off the walls. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, distinct and overlapping, some pleading, others accusing, all of them unrelenting. In the center of the cavern stood something I couldn't comprehend. It was a structure of sorts, but it didn't make sense. The lines were wrong, shifting and bending in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. Symbols, like the ones carved into the quarry walls, pulsed faintly on its surface, glowing and fading in a rhythm that felt alive. Cassie collapsed to her knees, staring at the structure with wide, unblinking eyes. What? What is it? I didn't answer because I didn't know. Every part of me wanted to look away, to turn and run, but I couldn't. The structure held me in place, its impossible angles drawing me in. The shadow poured into the cavern behind us, its tendrils spreading along the walls and floor, reaching for the structure. It pulsed with dark energy, the symbols glowing brighter in response. Then the whistlers appeared, emerging from the tunnel like specters. Their forms were more distinct now, their movements more human, but their faces were still blank, their mouths open in a constant, unnatural whistle. They didn't approach us. Instead, they formed a circle around the structure, their heads tilting toward it in unison. "What's happening?" Cassie whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing hum in the air. "I don't know," I said, pulling her to her feet. "But we can't stay here." As I turned to drag her back toward the tunnel, the structure emitted a pulse of light, brighter and colder than anything I'd ever seen. The cavern shook violently, and the whispers rose into a deafening chorus. The whistlers dropped to their knees, their mouths stretching wider, the whistle turning into a shriek that clawed at my ears. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils slamming into the structure. The symbols flared to life, their glow blinding, and a deep, guttural roar filled the cavern. The air itself seemed to split, the sound tearing through me as the ground beneath us began to crumble. We were out of time. The cavern floor cracked beneath us, jagged fissures spreading outward as if the earth itself were trying to swallow us whole. The blinding light from the structure intensified, strobing in violent pulses that made it impossible to see anything clearly. Cassie screamed, clutching my arm as the tremors nearly knocked us off our feet. The whistlers, still kneeling in their unnatural circle, tilted their heads back in unison. Their open mouths stretched impossibly wide, emitting a sound that wasn't whistling anymore. It was a piercing, inhuman wail that made my ears bleed. It wasn't just noise. It was power, raw and overwhelming, tearing through the cavern like a storm. The shadow surged again, its tendrils wrapping around the structure, trying to smother its pulsating light. But the symbols carved into its surface fought back, glowing brighter with each pulse. The air grew heavier, thick with a clash of forces far beyond anything I could comprehend. I felt like an intruder in some ancient battle, something primal and eternal. "Move!" I shouted at Cassie, pulling her toward the edge of the cavern. She stumbled, her face pale and drenched with sweat, but she obeyed her grip on my arm like a lifeline. Behind us, the structure released another wave of light, and the cavern shook violently. Chunks of rock rained down from above, crashing around us with deafening force. I ducked, shielding Cassie as best I could, my heart pounding with the knowledge that we were running out of time. The ground beneath the whistlers gave way first. One by one, their gaunt forms were swallowed by the collapsing floor, their wails cutting off abruptly as they disappeared into the darkness below. The shadow recoiled, its tendrils snapping back like whips, but it wasn't retreating, it was preparing. Then the structure spoke. Not in words, but in a sound that bypassed my ears and went straight into my skull. It was a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through my entire body, carrying a meaning I couldn't grasp but felt with every fiber of my being: judgment. The shadow surged forward, colliding with the structure in a final, desperate attack. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, knocking Cassie and me off our feet. The ground beneath us cracked wide open, and I grabbed for her hand as we slid toward the edge of a yawning chasm. "Hold on!" I screamed, my fingers digging into hers as I fought to keep her from falling. But the pull of the collapsing earth was too strong. The structure's light exploded, and the last thing I saw before we fell was the shadow splitting apart, its form unraveling into nothingness. We plunged into the void, the roar of the collapsing cavern fading into a suffocating silence. The darkness closed around us, cold and endless, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the whispers returned, faint, persistent, and closer than ever. We weren't alone, not anymore. The fall felt endless, the darkness swallowing every sense but the sound of my own ragged breathing and Cassie's muffled screams. My fingers dug into hers, clinging desperately as the cold, damp air rushed past us. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, we hit solid ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Pain shot through my body, sharp and unforgiving, as I gasped for air. Cassie groaned somewhere nearby, her voice weak but alive. We're still here," I managed to rasp, my voice barely above a whisper. Cassie stirred, her silhouette faint against the oppressive darkness. Where is here?" she croaked, coughing as she tried to. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The beam flickered weakly, illuminating the space around us. We were in another cavern, smaller than the one above, but no less unsettling. The walls were jagged, glistening with a strange, wet sheen that reflected the faint light in eerie patterns. The ground beneath us was uneven, covered in dirt and rubble. But what caught my attention were the carvings. They were everywhere, etched into the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The same strange symbols we had seen in the quarry, but here they were larger, more intricate. They glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. My stomach turned as I realized they weren't just decorations, they were warnings. Cassie's voice broke through my thoughts. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I heard nothing but the distant drip of water. Then it came. A faint hum, low and resonant, growing steadily louder. It wasn't the whistling this time. It was something deeper, more primal, vibrating through the cavern like the heartbeat of the earth itself. "We need to move," I said, pulling Cassie to her feet. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cavern stretched endlessly in all directions, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. The hum grew louder, and the ground began to tremble. The symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, their glow illuminating the space in flashes of cold, pale light. I swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound and froze. It was there, the shadow. Or at least what remained of it. Its form was fractured, its edges jagged and incomplete, but it was still moving, dragging itself toward us with an agonizing slowness. Its tendrils scraped across the ground, leaving deep grooves in the dirt, and its presence filled the air with an unbearable pressure. Cassie clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The whispers returned, louder and closer, their words incomprehensible but insistent. The shadow loomed closer, its fractured form pulsing with the same rhythm as the symbols. And for the first time, I understood. This wasn't a place we had stumbled into. It was a place we had been brought to, chosen for. The realization hit me like a blow. This wasn't chance. It had never been chance. The symbols, the whistling, the shadow, they weren't just random horrors lurking in the dark. They were part of something larger, something deliberate. We had been chosen. Cassie's grip on my arm tightened as the shadow dragged itself closer. Its fractured form pulsed erratically, pieces of it breaking apart only to reform moments later. It wasn't whole, but it was still powerful. The air grew heavier with every inch it closed between us, thick with the weight of its presence, and the whispers that now filled the cavern like a rising tide. "We can't stay here," Cassie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We have to find a way out." "There is no way out," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the pulsing symbols carved into the walls. They weren't just warnings, they were part of whatever force had brought us here. The rhythm of their glow matched the fractured shadow's movements, as though the two were connected, locked in some terrible, ancient cycle. And then the whispers changed. No longer incomprehensible, they spoke clearly, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Choose." The word echoed through the cavern, resonating deep in my chest. Cassie turned to me, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "What does it mean? Choose what?" I shook my head, panic rising in my throat. "I don't know." But even as I said it, a sickening certainty crept into my mind. This wasn't just about survival, it was about sacrifice. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils lashing out and slamming into the ground just feet from where we stood. The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern, knocking us both to the ground. I scrambled to my knees, my flashlight skittering away, its beam now illuminating something at the center of the cavern. A pedestal. It was carved from the same stone as the walls, its surface covered in glowing symbols that pulsed brighter than the rest. Resting atop it was an object, a jagged black shard that seemed to absorb the light around it. It radiated a cold, magnetic pull, drawing my gaze and filling me with a terrible understanding. The whispers grew louder. "Choose." Cassie stared at the shard, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It wants us to do something with that." I didn't respond. My mind raced, pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. The shadow, the symbols, the whispers. They were all bound to this shard. It was the source of the nightmare, the heart of whatever ancient force had claimed this place. But it was also the only way out. The shadow loomed over us now, its fractured form rippling with fury. Its tendrils lashed out again, this time striking the pedestal. The shard pulsed violently, its cold light cutting through the darkness like a blade. Cassie turned to me, her eyes wide with desperation. "If we don't do something, we're going to die." I reached for the shard. This was the choice. My hand hovered over the shard, the cold radiating from it biting into my skin before I even touched it. The whispers crescendoed, filling my head with a deafening roar of voices, each one distinct, each one demanding. "Choose. Choose." Cassie grabbed my arm. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "What if this is what it wants? What if taking it makes things worse?" I hesitated, the weight of her words crashing into me. The shard pulsed again, its jagged edges seeming to hum with anticipation. The shadow loomed closer, its tendrils writhing and snapping. desperate to reach the pedestal, but unable to cross the symbol's glowing barrier. It was trapped, but not for long. Cracks spidered through the floor, the ancient carvings beginning to dim under the relentless force of the entity's presence. "There's no time," I shouted back, my voice raw with fear and determination. "If we do nothing, it'll kill us anyway." The whispers shifted, their tone growing darker, more insistent. "Take it. Take it." I clenched my jaw and reached forward, wrapping my fingers around the shard. The moment my skin touched its surface, a shockwave of cold shot through my body like ice in my veins. The cavern erupted with light, the symbols flaring brighter than ever before. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed into my ears like static. The shadow screamed. Its form convulsed, tendrils flailing wildly as it recoiled from the pedestal. The shard's light pierced through its fractured body, tearing it apart piece by piece. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had made the right choice. Then the light from the shard turned inward. It wasn't the shadow being pulled into the shard. It was me. I felt my body lock in place, my breath stolen as an unbearable force tugged at my very core. The shard wasn't a weapon. It was a trap, one meant to bind the darkness to whoever dared claim it. "No!" Cassie screamed, grabbing my shoulders and trying to pull me back. "Let it go! You have to let it go!" But I couldn't. The shard's cold grip had taken hold of me, sinking deeper into my skin with every second. The symbols around us dimmed, their glow fading as the shard consumed their energy, and mine. The shadow, though wounded, began to reform, its fractured pieces pulling themselves back together. "Run," I choked out, my voice barely audible. "Cassie, you have to run." "I'm not leaving you," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils bypassing the pedestal entirely, aiming for Cassie. In that moment, something inside me snapped. With all the strength I had left, I wrenched the shard free from the pedestal and turned its pulsing light toward the entity. A final blinding explosion filled the cavern. The last thing I saw was Cassie's face, her scream lost in the roar of light and shadow colliding. Then everything went silent and dark. When I opened my eyes, the world was still. The cavern was gone, replaced by a vast, empty expanse of darkness. There was no sound, no light, no sensation, just nothingness. I tried to move, but my body felt disconnected, like it wasn't mine anymore. The shard was still in my hand, its cold pulse faint but steady, a chilling reminder of what I had done. "Cassie," I called out, my voice echoing endlessly into the void. There was no response. Panic clawed at me, but it was dulled by the overwhelming emptiness around me. I was alone, suspended in a space that felt timeless. The whispers that had once plagued me were gone, replaced by a crushing silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was dim at first, like the flicker of a dying flame, but it grew steadily brighter, casting pale light across the void. The glow took shape, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't Cassie, it was the shadow. But it wasn't the same fractured entity I had fought in the cavern. This time, it was whole. Its form more defined and almost human-like. Its face was blank, but its presence was suffocating. Its gaze, if it had one, fixed on me. The shard in my hand pulsed weakly, as if responding to the shadow's approach. "You've taken it," the shadow's voice resonated, not in sound but in thought. It spoke directly into my mind, a deep, hollow tone that carried the weight of countless lifetimes. And now you are bound. I tried to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow extended a hand, its long fingers pointing at the shard. This place, this cycle, it will never end. You are part of it now. The weight of its words crashed over me like a tidal wave. The shard had never been a weapon. It was a key, a piece of whatever force bound this place and all its horrors together. And by taking it, I had become its new keeper. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't how it ends. It always ends this way, the shadow replied, its tone almost mournful. And it always begins again. The void around us began to shift, the darkness folding and twisting. Shapes emerged, vague, indistinct at first, but they solidified into the jagged walls of the quarry, the familiar symbols glowing faintly once more. The cycle was resetting, just as the shadow had said, and I was at its center. In the distance, I saw Cassie. She stood at the edge of the quarry, her face pale and her eyes filled with tears as she called out my name. I tried to run to her, but my body wouldn't obey. I was no longer a part of her world. The shard pulsed in my hand, and I understood. I was trapped, bound to this place, and it was waiting for the next to come. The cycle had begun again. Cassie's voice echoed across the quarry, desperate and raw. Come back, please! Her figure grew smaller, fading into the haze that now blanketed the edges of this cursed place. I wanted to reach her, to scream her name, but my body was no longer mine. It was bound to the shard, to the cycle. The void shifted again, pulling me back into the quarry's depths. The jagged cliffs loomed around me like silent sentinels, their walls carved with the ancient symbols I now understood all too well. They weren't warnings, they were bindings. They told the story of the cycle, the endless loop of light, shadow, and sacrifice that had ensnared so many before me. I looked down at the shard still clutched in my hand. Its once frigid surface now burned with a cold fire, the symbols etched into it pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Or maybe it wasn't my heartbeat anymore. Maybe it was the shard's. The faint sound of whistling began again, distant and haunting, carried on an unseen wind. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just noise, it was a summons. The quarry was calling out, preparing for its next victim, its next chosen. I staggered forward, driven by some unseen force, my body no longer obeying my will. The whispers returned, their voices clearer now, no longer a chaotic jumble. They spoke with purpose, overlapping in a chorus that resonated deep in my mind. You are the keeper. You are the watcher. You are the tether. No! I screamed, my voice breaking. I'm not part of this. I didn't choose this. The quarry answered with silence, its cold indifference pressing down on me. The shadow emerged from the depths once more, no longer fractured but whole. It loomed over me, its form shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a storm. You have chosen, it said, its voice as hollow and eternal as the void itself. And now you will serve. The shard flared, its light cutting through the shadow's form. For a fleeting moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe I could break free, destroy the shard, end the cycle once and for all. But the shadow's tendrils wrapped around me, cold and unyielding. You are bound, it whispered, and you will remain until another takes your place. The realization hit me like a dagger. The shard. wasn't a tool to destroy the cycle, it was the chain that bound the keeper to it. And now, I was the chain's anchor. In the distance I saw movement, a figure entering the quarry, their silhouette hesitant and cautious. Another camper, another explorer, another victim. The shard pulsed in my hand, pulling me toward them. The cycle demanded it. The quarry demanded it. As I stepped forward, the whispers grew louder, their haunting melody now my own. I opened my mouth, and the sound escaped, soft, melodic, and unmistakable. The whistling had begun again. I was the whistler now.